The coffee was still hot when she handed me the papers. That's the detail I remember most. Not the sound of her voice, not the way she looked at me across the kitchen table, just the coffee, still steaming, sitting there like everything was normal while my wife of 23 years told me she wanted a divorce. Her name was Brenda. Is Brenda. You don't stop knowing someone's name just because they stop being your person. I set the mug down. I didn't say anything right away. That was always something she hated about me. My silences. She called them passive-aggressive. I called them thinking. 23 years and we never agreed on that one either. I've already spoken to an attorney, she said. She was standing by the refrigerator, arms crossed. She'd been practicing this, I could tell. The posture was too deliberate. I think it's best if we handle this civilly. Civilly, that was her word. I picked up the papers, looked at the first page, looked at the second, set them face down on the table. Okay, I said. She blinked. That wasn't the reaction she'd rehearsed for. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a senior auditor for a regional accounting firm in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of firm that handles municipal contracts, nonprofit compliance, mid-size business reviews. I retired 2 years before this conversation happened. My whole career was built on one skill, reading numbers until they told me the truth, even when someone had worked very hard to make them lie. I want you to understand that before I tell you the rest of this story, the signs had been there for about 14 months before the papers. I don't say that to sound smart. I say it because I spent a long time being angry at myself for not acting sooner, for telling myself I was imagining things, for choosing comfort over clarity. That's what long marriages do to you. They teach you to explain away the things that don't fit because the alternative is too heavy to carry. The first thing I noticed was the credit card. We had always kept joint accounts. That was just how we'd done things. One checking, one savings, 2 credit cards that both our names were on. It worked fine for 20 years. Then one evening I was going through the mail and I found a statement for a card I didn't recognize. The name on it was only hers. The address was ours, but I had never seen this card before. I mentioned it at dinner. She said she'd opened it for personal expenses, said she wanted some financial independence, which was a reasonable thing to say, so I let it go. People are allowed to have their own accounts. That's not a crime. I put it in the back of my mind and went on with my evening. But I'm an auditor, or I was. The habit doesn't leave you just because you retire, and the habit says 1 anomaly is nothing, 2 anomalies is a coincidence. 3 anomalies is a pattern. The second thing was the mileage. Brenda drove a silver Subaru Outback. She was semi-retired. She'd stepped back from her interior design clients down to maybe 4 or 5 a year, mostly referrals from old relationships. She didn't commute. She didn't have anywhere she needed to be on a regular schedule. But I started noticing, in that quiet way you notice things you don't want to notice, that the car was gone more than it used to be. Not every day. Not in the way that was obvious, but often enough. I didn't check her phone. I want to be clear about that. Some people will think I should have. Some people will think I had every right to. Maybe they're correct. But that wasn't the choice I made because I knew what kind of man I was and what kind of investigation I was capable of running. And I decided I was going to handle this the way I had handled every difficult audit in my career, with documentation, not emotion. The third thing was a name. His name was Curtis. She mentioned him once in passing, a colleague she'd reconnected with through an old design industry contact. She said his name the way people say names they've been practicing saying casually. I nodded. I noted it. 3 anomalies. That was enough for me to know that something was happening. I just didn't know yet how deep it went. I called my son Theodore that same week. He lives in Portland now, works in software, married with 2 kids. He's a good man. He got my stubbornness and his mother's charm, which is a useful combination if you manage it right. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't want to alarm him before I knew what I was actually dealing with. I just said his mother and I were having some difficulties. that I was looking into a few things and that I might need his help soon. He said, "Dad, what kind of help?" I said, "The kind where you trust your old man and don't ask questions yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, that's the relationship we have. It took years to build that kind of trust. I'm grateful for it every single day. I started keeping a log in early March, a spiral notebook, nothing digital, old habit from the early days of my career before everything moved to software. Date, time, observation, context. I dated every entry. March 7, Brenda left house at 11:14 a.m., returned at 4:52 p.m., said she was meeting a client in Worthington. No invoice generated in our shared business folder that week. March 14, notice new perfume, not a brand she'd worn before. Did not comment. March 22nd, found receipt in jacket pocket, not mine. Men's jacket, left in hallway closet, restaurant in the short north. Dinner for two, date March 20. I was in Cincinnati that weekend visiting my brother. I held that receipt for a long time. Stood in the hallway closet with the door half open and the receipt in my hand and the sound of the television coming from the living room where my wife was watching her Thursday night show. I thought about walking in there and putting it on the coffee table in front of her. I put it back in the jacket pocket instead, took a photo of it first. That was the moment I decided I was going to do this properly. I contacted an attorney in April. Her name was Vivian Chin, a family law specialist with an office in Dublin, Ohio, about 20 minutes from our house. She came recommended by a colleague of mine from the firm who'd gone through a divorce 7 years earlier. Vivian was direct. That's the quality I valued most. She sat across from me in her office and let me talk for 20 minutes, and then she said, "Before we discuss the marriage, I need to understand the finances." I told her about my retirement, our savings, the house. We'd bought it in 2001 for $340,000. It was worth somewhere north of $680,000 now. We had a joint brokerage account, 2 IRAs, a small rental property in Guyana we'd bought with an inheritance from my father. Vivian wrote things down. Then she looked up and said, "Have you reviewed your brokerage statements recently?" I said I had, but not closely, not with the eye I used to bring to my work. She said, "I'd recommend doing that." I went home and pulled up the account. I sat at the desk in our spare bedroom, the one we'd always called the office, and I went through 14 months of statements the way I used to go through a client's books. It took me 3 evenings. By the end of the 3rd evening, I had a list of 17 transactions I couldn't explain. Not large amounts individually. The largest was $4,200. The smallest was $800. But together they added up to just over $41,000. Transfers out. Different destination accounts. No notes, no labels, no corresponding deposits anywhere in our shared records that I could find. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then I called Vivian. "This is more than a divorce matter now," she said. We were back in her office. I'd brought printouts, organized by date, with each anomalous transaction highlighted in yellow. Old habits. Vivian looked through them carefully. She didn't rush. I appreciated that. "I'm not a forensic accountant," she said, "but I know what this looks like, and I think you need one. I have someone I work with regularly. His name is Phil Decker. Very thorough, very discreet." I said I knew how to do a thorough and discreet investigation myself. She smiled. "I know you do, but you're the husband, not the auditor in this situation. You need someone whose findings can hold up in court, someone who isn't emotionally involved." I didn't argue with that. Phil came on board the following week. He was a quiet man in his mid-50s, former IRS, moved into private practice about 15 years back. We met at a coffee shop near his office, and he let me walk him through everything I'd compiled. He took my notebook. He took the printed statements. He called me 10 days later. "Your wife has been moving money into a joint account held with another individual," he said. The account was opened 18 months ago. The other account holder is a man named Curtis Merritt. He runs a residential design firm in the Columbus metro area. I didn't say anything for a moment. How much? I asked. Total transfers from the accounts we've been able to trace so far, just over $94,000. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Kroger when he told me that. I remember staring at a shopping cart that someone had left in the middle of a parking space. She wasn't just hiding an affair, I said. No, Phil said, she wasn't. This is the part of the story where most men would have confronted their wives. I understand that impulse completely. If you had told me 5 years ago that I would sit in the same house as my wife for 6 more months after learning what I learned that day in the Kroger parking lot, I would have told you that was impossible. But I'm 63 years old, and I have a daughter named Claire who lives in Nashville, and a son in Portland, and a rental property in Gahanna. And I have 31 years of professional experience telling me that the worst thing you can do in the middle of an investigation is let the subject know they're being investigated. So I went home. I made dinner. I sat across from my wife and talked about the weather and a documentary we'd both been meaning to watch. And when she asked how my day was, I said fine. The performance of it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Theodore called every Sunday. I told him we were in the information gathering phase. He didn't push. Good kid. Claire called too, but she's more like her mother. She reads rooms, she notices things, so I had to be more careful with her. I told her her mother and I were going through a rough patch and that I'd have more information soon. She went quiet in that particular way she has when she's putting pieces together and not liking the picture they make. Dad, she said, are you okay? I will be, I said. That was the honest answer. By September, Phil had traced the full picture. Brenda and Curtis had been together for at least 2 years. The financial transfers had been ongoing for 18 months. She had also moved approximately $22,000 from our joint savings account into a personal account that I was not on, in small increments, nothing over $3,000 at a time, spread across 11 months. Classic structuring pattern. She hadn't done it consciously as a legal strategy. I don't think she had that level of sophistication, but it had the shape of it regardless. The rental property in Gahanna was the piece that changed the nature of what we were dealing with. Brenda had power of attorney over the property management. We'd set it up years ago for practical reasons, so she could handle maintenance contractors and tenant issues without both of us needing to be present for every signature. She had used that authority 11 months earlier to attempt to refinance the property. The refinance had fallen through, but the application, which I had never seen or authorized, listed Curtis Merritt as a co-owner. That was not a clerical error. Phil flagged it. Vivian flagged it louder. This goes beyond marital asset dissipation, Vivian said. What she did with the POA may constitute fraud. I want to bring in someone from the financial crime side before we file anything. I looked at her across the desk. I've been waiting for the right moment, I said. You tell me when. She said, soon. Brenda filed for divorce in November. She told me on a Tuesday evening. She had, apparently, been waiting for me to say something first, and when I hadn't, she decided to move. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, same table, different conversation, and told me she hadn't been happy for a long time, that she thought we'd grown apart, that she hoped we could be adults about this. She did not mention Curtis. I said, okay. She blinked again. Same blink as the first time. I've already retained an attorney, she said. She named the firm, a high-profile divorce practice in downtown Columbus, the kind with glass offices on the 18th floor and a reputation for aggressive asset division. Curtis was presumably funding it. That's fine, I said. I have representation too. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Not quite suspicion, more like recalibration. That night I called Vivian and told her Brenda had filed. Good, Vivian said. Now we move. The discovery process was where my wife's attorneys made their first significant error. They came in with a posture of maximum aggression, which is understandable given what they believe they were working with. A retired auditor with modest income, a wife who had been steadily repositioning assets for 18 months, and a case they expected to conclude in her favor inside of 90 days. They did not know about Phil's report. They did not know that I had 17 months of documentation in a spiral notebook and 4 expandable file folders organized by category. They did not know that Vivian had, in quiet coordination with a financial crimes attorney named Robert Tay, already prepared a referral package for the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office regarding the Gaigana property refinance application. The deposition was held in January at a neutral location, a conference room in an office building on Polaris Parkway. Brenda arrived with her attorney, a woman named Holloway, who had the manner of someone accustomed to winning quickly. Brenda was dressed carefully. She looked confident. She had not worn her wedding ring. I noticed that. I noted it. When they saw the size of the document packet Vivian brought in, Holloway's expression shifted slightly, just slightly. The kind of shift you only notice if you spent decades watching people's faces change when numbers don't add up the way they expected. We went through it methodically. Every transfer, every account, every date. Phil's full report annotated and cross-referenced. At one point, Holloway asked for a recess. She and Brenda stepped into the hallway. I poured a glass of water. Vivian leaned over and said quietly, "How are you doing?" "I'm fine," I said. She nodded. "It's almost over." The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late February. Theodore flew in from Portland. He didn't ask. He just called me Sunday and said, "I'm coming." Claire drove up from Nashville the night before. They met me at Vivian's office that morning, and the 3 of us sat in the small conference room while she walked us through what was going to happen. When she finished, Theodore looked at me and said, "Dad, you did all this while we were just living our regular lives." I said, "That's the job." He shook his head slowly. Claire reached over and put her hand on mine and didn't say anything. That was enough. The courthouse was on Mound Street, the way it always has been. We arrived early. Brenda and Holloway were already in the hallway outside the courtroom, Brenda in a gray blazer, hair done, composed. She looked at me when I walked in with Theodore and Claire on either side of me. I saw her register my children. I saw something move across her face. I sat down at the respondent's table. Vivian sat beside me. Robert Tay was present as well, seated in the gallery. The judge came in. The proceedings began. Brenda's side presented first. The argument was predictable. Long marriage, my retirement income, her contribution to the household, standard division of joint assets. Holloway was polished. I'll give her that. Then it was our turn. Vivian presented the financial documentation in stages, the way a good audit finding is always presented. Context first, then anomaly, then pattern, then impact. She did not rush. She let each piece land. I watched Brenda's face as the transfers were read into the record. I watched her face when the Gahanna refinance application came up and Curtis Merritt's name was read aloud in open court. I watched Holloway lean over and say something to her in a low voice, and I watched Brenda's composure, that careful, practiced composure she'd brought into the room, begin to come apart at the edges. The judge called a brief recess. In the hallway, Vivian walked beside me and said very quietly, "The prosecutor's office confirmed this morning they're unsealing today." I stopped walking. "Today," I said. "They've been waiting on the hearing. Robert coordinated the timing." She paused. "This is what we planned for." I thought about the Kroger parking lot. I thought about the spiral notebook. I thought about 6 months of dinner conversations and Sunday phone calls and the particular weight of knowing something you can't yet say out loud. "Okay," I said. We went back in. The rest of the hearing moved quickly. Vivian argued for full restitution of the transferred assets, exclusive rights to the Gahana property, and primary disposition of the marital home pending final judgment. Given the documented evidence of asset dissipation and the pending fraud referral, she argued Brenda had forfeited any equitable claim she might otherwise have asserted. Holloway objected to several points. The judge noted the objections and overruled them. When the gavel came down, the judge had awarded me the Gahana property outright, ordered the return of the transferred funds pending further proceedings, and issued a freeze on the joint accounts pending review. It was not a complete resolution. These things never are, not on day one. But it was a foundation. I was standing up to gather my papers when a court officer approached Brenda. I saw him say something to her. I saw her look at him, then look at Holloway, then look across the room at me. Holloway put her hand on Brenda's arm. That told me everything I needed to know. Theodore came up behind me. He put his hand on my shoulder and said nothing. Claire came around and stood beside me. She was blinking fast the way she does when she's trying not to cry. I put my arm around her. "It's done," I said. "Or it's beginning to be." The fraud charges were formally filed the following week. The refinance application on the Gahana property, filed using power of attorney under false pretenses with an unauthorized co-owner listed, that was the foundation. The structuring pattern in the savings account withdrawals was flagged as supplementary evidence. Curtis Merritt was named as a co-respondent in the civil proceedings. I'm not going to tell you I felt nothing when I heard that. That would be a lie. But I want to be honest about something else too, because I think it matters. I spent a long time in those 6 months of silence and documentation thinking about what I actually wanted out of all of this. And the answer, when I got quiet enough to hear it, was not revenge. It was not to see my wife of 23 years standing in a courtroom being handed a charging document. What I wanted was the truth on the record. What I wanted was for my children to know their father had handled the hardest thing he'd ever faced with his dignity intact. What I wanted was to walk out of that building knowing I had done this right. I got that. Theodore came over for dinner the night after the charges were filed. He brought his wife, Karen, and they brought the kids, which meant the house was loud for the first time in months. My granddaughter, who was 4, fell asleep on the couch watching television, and I sat in the armchair across from her and just looked at her for a while. There is a kind of quiet that comes after a long thing is over. It doesn't feel like relief exactly. It feels more like setting down something very heavy that you've been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't part of your body. That's what it felt like. Claire called me from Nashville about 2 weeks later. She'd been processing, she said. She had questions, practical ones, emotional ones, questions about what the next year would look like. I answered what I could. I told her the house would likely sell, that I was looking at a smaller place in Bexley, that I was genuinely fine, not performing fine, actually fine. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, I have to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "When did you know? Like really know it was all going wrong?" I thought about that for a moment. "The credit card," I said. "The first one I found." I didn't know then, not consciously, but something in me knew, and I made a choice to start paying attention instead of explaining it away. She said, "I think most people would have just confronted her." "Most people would have," I said. "That's not a criticism, but I'm not most people. I'm a 63-year-old man who spent 31 years watching what happens when you confront a problem before you understand it. You give the other side time to prepare. You lose the advantage of clarity." She laughed a little. "You're such an auditor, Dad." "I know," I said. "It's the only thing that saved me." The house sold in April. I closed on the Bexley place on a Wednesday and moved in that weekend with Theodore's help. Him and his friend Marcus carried boxes while I directed traffic and pretended I was doing more than I was. The new place is smaller, quieter, better suited to who I am now than the house we'd shared for 19 years ever really was toward the end. I have a desk by the window in the second bedroom, good light in the mornings. I've been writing things down, not a log this time, not an audit, just thoughts. Turns out I have more of them than I realized, now that I have space to hear them. My neighbor, an older woman named Phyllis, brought over a casserole the second week I was there. We sat on the front porch for an hour and talked about the neighborhood, about her late husband, about what it means to start over when you're past 60. She said, "You don't look like a man who's been through what it sounds like you've been through." I said, "I had a good plan." She laughed. "That's either the best thing a person can have or the saddest." I thought about it. "Both," I said, "depending on the day." I thought a lot about what the word consequences actually means, not as a threat, not the way people use it when they're angry and want to scare someone. I mean it in the plainest possible sense, the idea that what you do today becomes the shape of what happens to you tomorrow, whether you intend it or not. Brenda didn't wake up one morning and decide to blow up her own life. I don't believe that. I think it started small, the way these things always do. A small dishonesty here, a small justification there. And the terrible thing about small dishonesties is that they're comfortable. They don't announce themselves. They just quietly build a structure under your feet that you don't realize is rotten until the morning you put your full weight on it and it gives way. I'm not saying I was a perfect husband. I wasn't. I worked long hours for years. I was better at balancing ledgers than I was at saying out loud what I felt. There are things I could have done differently. I've sat with that. But there is a difference between the ordinary failures of a long marriage and choosing, deliberately, to take from someone who trusted you. That difference matters. It always matters. What I keep coming back to, now that the dust has settled and I'm sitting in a quieter house in Bexley with coffee and decent morning light, is this: the truth has a kind of patience that people underestimate. It doesn't rush. It doesn't announce itself. It just waits, and if you have the discipline to work with it instead of against it, to gather it carefully, to let it accumulate, to resist the urge to deploy it before it's ready, it becomes the most powerful thing in the room. That's what I had. Not intelligence exactly, not cleverness, just the discipline to stay quiet when every instinct said to speak, to document when every emotion said to confront, to trust the process, even when the process felt impossibly slow. Theodore asked me once, toward the end of it all, whether I ever doubted myself, whether there were nights in those 6 months when I wondered if I was doing the right thing. I told him the truth, yes. Almost every night in the first 2 months. I'd lie there and run through every decision I'd made and wonder if I was being cold, if I was being calculating in a way that said something bad about who I was. I'd wonder if a better man would have just walked in and said what he knew and let the chips fall. But then I'd think about Claire and Theodore. I'd think about what it meant to hand them a story about their father, not just what happened, but how he handled it. Whether he let the worst thing that ever happened to him turn him into someone he wasn't, whether he stayed all the way through, someone they could respect. That was the standard I held myself to. Not winning, not punishing anyone, just be someone your kids can look at without flinching. I think I did that. I hope I did. Phyllis from next door told me I didn't look like a man who'd been through what I'd been through. I told her I had a good plan, but honestly, the plan was the easy part. The hard part was the months before the plan paid off. The ordinary Tuesday evenings, the dinners, the pretending, the weight of knowing carried alone. Endurance is not a glamorous quality. Nobody puts it on a list of things they admire in a person. But it is, I think, the quality that determines most of the important outcomes in a life. Not brilliance, not luck, just the willingness to carry something heavy long enough for it to be worth carrying. I'm 63 years old. I have 2 kids I'm proud of, and a rental property and a desk by a window with good light. I've set down the heavy thing, and some mornings when it's quiet and the coffee is hot, that feels like more than enough.